We have a pretty set idea of what writing looks like. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You know the drill. You're probably also aware of different writing systems. Chinese or Korean characters, Arabic script, and the Cyrillic alphabet. Thinking about ancient writing will probably call the Latin and Greek alphabets to mind, as well as Egyptian hieroglyphs. But what about my pointy little friends here? This is cuneiform, the writing system developed in ancient Mesopotamia and used for close to 4,000 years. This video explores the amazing story behind its modern decipherment. Like, subscribe, come along for the ride. If you've ever heard anything about ancient Mesopotamia, chances are that you'll have at least seen cuneiform. Believe it or not, these little wedges are part of a remarkably complex writing system that was used from the 4th millennium BCE all the way through to the early 1st millennium CE. That's close to 4,000 years. During that time, it was adapted to record several languages, a couple of which were completely unrelated, including Sumerian, Akkadian, Elamite, 🀭, and Old Persian. It's as if the Latin alphabet we use to write English was not only used to write English, French, and German, but also Chinese and Russian. Unlike our own writing system, cuneiform is generally not an alphabetic script, with the exception of some like 🀭 and Old Persian cuneiform. Instead of each sign representing a single letter, signs were syllabic, representing a single syllable, or logographic, representing a whole word. Cuneiform was most usually written on clay tablets, which survived remarkably well in the archaeological record, providing a fantastically rich written resource for scholars of the ancient world. However, as you might imagine, given the extreme differences between cuneiform and our own understanding of written language, deciphering it was a long and arduous process that required the work of many people. Because of the very visible nature of the monuments they're inscribed upon, people have been aware of cuneiform inscriptions for a long time. In the early 1600s, the Spanish ambassador to Persia sent a letter in which he described cuneiform inscriptions. The letters themselves are neither Chaldean, nor Hebrew, nor Greek, nor Arabic, nor of any other nation which was ever found of old, or at this day to be extant. They are all three-cornered, but somewhat long, of the form of a pyramid, or such a little obelisk as I have set in the margin, so that in nothing do they differ one from another, but in their placing and situation, yet so conformed that they are wondrous plain, distinct, and perspicuous. Early copies of cuneiform inscriptions were often inaccurate and confusing. One copy made in 1627 by Sir Thomas Herbert shows what is apparently a 3-line inscription. Unfortunately, this was actually 2 lines from one inscription, while the 3rd line was from another inscription entirely. This kind of error made early attempts at decipherment all but impossible. Herbert describes cuneiform as pyramids inverted, or with bases upwards, triangles or deltas, going on to say that the characters are of a strange and unusual shape, neither like letters nor hieroglyphics. He even went so far as to suggest that while cuneiform was completely incomprehensible, the signs may depict full words or syllables rather than individual letters. While a wholly accurate speculation, this idea would not be proven correct for nearly 100 years. It wasn't until the late 1700s that accurate copies of cuneiform inscriptions were seen in the West, thanks to Carsten Niebuhr, a German explorer working for the Danish government. In his publication from Persepolis, he also demonstrated that the inscriptions from that site were actually 3 different written languages. Following Niebuhr's publication, scholars made considerable progress in deciphering one of those languages, Old Persian. In 1802, a German schoolteacher named Georg Friedrich Grotefend made the first real progress with the mysterious script. Using Niebuhr's copies of the trilingual inscriptions from Persepolis, Grotefend observed a recurring pattern in the signs. He argued that a particular set of signs which occurred with great frequency must refer to the Persian word for king, and, based on his knowledge of Sasanian inscriptions and the works of the Greek writer Herodotus, he successfully identified royal titularies of 2 Persian kings, Darius and Xerxes. The next substantial progress was made in 1836 by two men, Christian Lassen, a Norwegian scholar at the University of Bonn, and a French scholar, Eugene Bernauff, who discovered that the first of Niebuhr's published inscriptions contained a list of the satrapies ruled by the Persian king Darius. Exactly which man should be credited with this discovery is somewhat difficult to ascertain. Lassen's work was published 1 month before that of Bernauff, and while both men claimed to have made the discovery independently of one another, they were in close communication at the time. Bernauff is usually the man credited with this discovery, while Lassen was apparently attacked within his lifetime by other scholars for claiming that his discovery was independent. Whichever man was responsible, it was a fantastic step toward the decipherment of cuneiform and enabled Bernauff to publish an Old Persian cuneiform alphabet of 30 letters, the majority of which he correctly identified. At the same time that Lassen and Bernauff were working on cuneiform in Europe, a British soldier serving as a military advisor to the governor of Kurdistan, Henry Creswick Rawlinson, was tackling the same scripts in Persia. Unfortunately isolated from the European scholarly community, Rawlinson spent considerable time during the 1830s copying various trilingual inscriptions. Aware only of Grotefend's discovery of some personal names, he worked independently to translate the Old Persian inscriptions from Hamadan. Successfully identifying the same names as Grotefend, he used this information to construct a working preliminary alphabet of Old Persian. Rawlinson was also able to copy the large trilingual inscription at Behistun, the longest cuneiform inscription known at that time, and an inscription often referred to by modern scholars as the Rosetta Stone of Assyriology. Given that the inscription is carved into a rock face some 330 feet above ground, gaining accurate copies of it was not only difficult, but incredibly dangerous. Rawlinson was successful, and thankfully didn't die in the endeavour, and set to work translating the opening portion of the Old Persian text of the Behistun inscription. Before he could publish his findings, he obtained copies of Lassen and Bernauff's research. This led to some necessary revisions of his own work, which was finally published in 1847 and 1849. The decipherment of Old Persian, both the script and the language, was all but complete. With one of the 3 languages found on trilingual cuneiform inscriptions successfully deciphered, scholars were able to move on to the other 2 languages, Elamite and Akkadian. The key to the decipherment were the proper nouns recorded in the inscriptions, including personal names and place names, which is why Lassen and Bernauff's identification of the Persian satrapies was so important. As proper names are generally written with the same phonetics, regardless of the language being used, this means, for example, if you have successfully identified my name, Megan, in this English sentence, then you can likewise identify it in the accompanying French and German sentences. So, the identification of names like Darius in the Old Persian portion of the trilingual inscriptions from Persia provided the same information for the Elamite and Akkadian inscriptions, meaning that scholars could then identify those same signs elsewhere in the text. Another scholar working on this was the Reverend Edward Hinks. In 1846, he published a paper where he spent considerable time noting the similarities and differences between these 3 languages, which he referred to as First, Second, and Third Persepolitan. Hinks observed that Third Persepolitan, Akkadian, seemed to have more in common with the Semitic language than anything else. Then, in 1847, Hinks correctly identified the Akkadian first-person pronoun. That's right, he deciphered the Akkadian word for I. This is actually far more exciting than it may seem, as it was the first time that an Akkadian word, which was not a proper noun, had been translated. In his 1849 paper on the 🀭Support inscriptions, Hinks made a couple of important observations. First, that 2 visually distinct signs may have the same syllabic reading, hypothesizing that this was because of the influence of a foreign language on the Akkadian writing system. His hypothesis was entirely correct, though the identity of that language would remain unknown for some years. We know today that this is the impact of the Sumerian language, which cuneiform was created for. This is, I would argue, one of the most important steps in the decipherment of cuneiform, as identifying the correct reading of any individual sign is the first step in translating any cuneiform text. Without recognizing that there are multiple possible values, there is no hope of a successful translation. Hinks' second observation was that cuneiform signs are fully syllabic, that is, every sign which is not a logogram or a determinative is a whole syllable and never a single consonant. Both of these discoveries were preempted, at least in part, by Paul-Émile Botta, an Italian-French scientist who served as a diplomat in Mosul. Botta is most well known for the modern discovery of the Neo-Assyrian city, 🀭Sharrukin, but in an 1847 paper, Botta also argued that the writing system did not seem to indicate a Semitic language, and that it was syllabic. These claims must have been deeply disconcerting for Rawlinson, who had been arguing the exact opposite in his own lectures to the Royal Asiatic Society. In one such lecture, he asserted that cuneiform must have come from Egypt, and that the cuneiform signs sometimes represent a complete syllable and sometimes only one sound from a syllable. This was completely contrary to Hinks' discoveries, not to mention what we know of cuneiform today. Rawlinson even went so far to say that anything Hinks got correct in his assessment of Akkadian cuneiform was down to luck rather than judgment. He apparently did not deal well with competition. Despite his differences of opinion with Hinks and his misunderstanding of Akkadian, in 1850 Rawlinson successfully published a translation of the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser, a monumental text that deals with the military campaigns of Shalmaneser III, who ruled during the 9th century BCE. The majority of the translation was correct, with only the proper names being problematic, largely due to the fact that Akkadian personal names are often written with logograms, whose meanings are somewhat esoteric without access to Akkadian syllabaries. As a brief aside, these syllabaries and other reference texts created by ancient scribes were an indispensable tool in the quest to decipher Akkadian cuneiform. These include lists of signs and words which were collected and organized for the convenience of scribes. Lists of cuneiform signs were written out with their various phonetic values, as well as the name of the sign and the Akkadian and Sumerian translations of those signs. Without resources like these, it would have been much more difficult to decipher and translate Sumerian and Akkadian texts. In 1853, Hinks presented a paper on the Assyrio-Babylonian phonetic characters, where he listed 346 cuneiform signs with their values, at least 118 of which had not been previously deciphered. He also goes into more detail of the non-Semitic nature of the writing system. He correctly argued that other researchers were having limited success because they insisted on viewing cuneiform as a script that was invented for a Semitic language. Here again we see friction between Rawlinson and Hinks, with Hinks remarking, "Colonel Rawlinson has not only adopted my system of classifying the characters, but my method of investigating their values." If, then, it is alleged that Colonel Rawlinson was led to alter his views by his having adopted a better method of investigation than he previously used, and not by the statements which I had made, I must reply that this better method is itself to be found in my previous publication. At this same time, a man named Austin Henry Layard was presenting his excavations of the ancient city of Nineveh, the site of Ashurbanipal's library, for publication. Layard employed Hinks to help him with the inscriptional material, and then convinced the British Museum to employ Hinks for a year to work on the cuneiform holdings. Rawlinson was less than thrilled, both with Hinks' museum appointment and with Layard apparently siding with Hinks in their decipherment disagreements. Despite the progress made by both Hinks and Rawlinson, it seems as though relatively few scholars were willing to accept their findings. One wrote of his skepticism, asking what people were expected to think of a writing system in which the same sign could be pronounced a, ha, pa, and bu. In defense of their position, a man named Henry Fox Talbot, a scientist and inventor most well known for his advancements in photography, wrote in an 1856 letter to the president of the Royal Asiatic Society, "Many persons have hitherto refused to believe in the truth of the system by which Dr. Hinks and Sir H. Rawlinson have interpreted the Assyrian writings, because it contains many things entirely contrary to their preconceived opinions. For example, each cuneiform syllable group represents a syllable, but not always the same syllable, sometimes one and sometimes another." To which it is replied that such a license would open the door to all manner of uncertainty, that the ancient Assyrians themselves, the natives of the country, could never have reached such a kind of understanding, and that, therefore, the system cannot be true, and the interpretations based upon it must be fallacious. It may have been this air of academic disbelief that prompted Fox Talbot to suggest, in the same letter, a competition of decipherment. Along with his letter, Fox Talbot had sent a translation of a recently discovered cuneiform text detailing the military and hunting achievements of Tiglath-Pileser I, who ruled from 1114 BCE to 1076 BCE. CE. He asked that the Royal Society request translations of that same text from Hinks and Rawlinson so that the three might be compared in order to ascertain if this apparently impossible script had actually been deciphered. This suggestion was met with some enthusiasm, and not only were Hinks and Rawlinson invited to participate, but so was 𝀭Support, another scholar who happened to be in London. All three submitted their translations in sealed envelopes to the Society, and on the 25th of May 1857 the translations were opened and reviewed by a committee of 5. While there were differences between the translations, the committee decided that there were too many similarities to be due to chance alone. The general sense of the translations were in line with one another, and in many cases the English words chosen to render the same Akkadian were either very similar or identical. For example, here's the opening line of the inscription as translated by Rawlinson, Talbot, and 𝀭Support. Hinks did not attempt this first line. Rawlinson: Ashur, the great lord, ruling supreme over the gods, the giver of sceptres and crowns, the appointer of sovereignty. Fox Talbot: Ashur, the great lord of great majesty, king of the race of the gods, giver of the sceptre and the crown, establisher of royalty. 𝀭Support: God Ashur, great lord, ruler of the legions of gods, who bestows sceptre and honour, who takes off royalty. These translations were similar enough that the committee reported that cuneiform had indeed been deciphered. The translations were published later in the year, and the field of Assyriology has never been the same.